Barbara sat at the dining table in a large house in America, holding a cold pink drink. Ice touched the glass softly. Karen, her daughter-in-law, smiled too sweetly. "I made this for you, Barbara," she said. "A special treat for my favorite mother-in-law." Around them, people laughed and ate roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and corn. Christopher, Barbara's son, was talking near the fireplace. No one noticed Karen watching Barbara closely. Barbara lifted the glass, then stopped. Something inside warned her not to drink it. She lowered it with a calm smile. Across the table sat Ashley, Karen's mother, talking loudly about money and vacations. Barbara waited. When Karen turned away and Ashley reached for bread, Barbara quietly switched the drinks. Then she folded her hands and watched the clock. 35 minutes later, Ashley stopped talking in the middle of a story. She blinked hard and touched her forehead. "Are you okay?" Christopher asked, putting down his fork. Ashley forced a laugh. "I'm fine," she said, but her words came out slow. Karen's smile vanished for a second. Ashley reached for her water, but her hand shook badly. The glass tipped over and spilled across the table. Chairs scraped the floor. "Mom!" Karen shouted, rushing to her side. Ashley tried to stand but nearly fell. Everyone panicked. Barbara stayed seated, still holding the untouched drink meant for her. Christopher looked confused. "What happened?" he asked. Barbara raised the glass slightly. "This is the drink Karen gave me," she said softly. The room fell silent. Sirens sounded outside moments later. Before that night, Barbara had lived a simple life in America. She was not rich, but she was proud. After her husband died, she worked 2 jobs to raise Christopher alone. He was 12 then, kind and helpful. He folded laundry, washed dishes, and often said, "One day I'll take care of you, Mom." Barbara believed him. They were close for many years. Then Christopher met Karen at work. He brought her home smiling proudly. Karen was beautiful and confident. "Your home is cozy," she said while looking around. Barbara smiled, though something felt cold in her tone. At dinner Karen praised the meatloaf. "I didn't know homemade food could taste this good," she said. Christopher laughed, missing the insult hidden inside her words. Small insults soon became common. Karen corrected Christopher in front of others. She rolled her eyes when Barbara spoke. One Christmas she handed Barbara a gold-wrapped gift. Inside was wrinkle cream. "You should start using this now," Karen said cheerfully. Christopher laughed awkwardly. Barbara forced a smile. Another day Karen offered to teach her how to use a laptop. "Older people struggle with these things," she said. Every word sounded polite, yet each one hurt. Then Barbara met Karen's mother, Ashley. She arrived at the engagement dinner wearing diamonds and speaking loudly. She barely greeted Barbara. During dinner she turned to Christopher and asked, "Are you sure you want to marry into such a humble family?" The table went quiet. Christopher laughed nervously, but he did not defend his mother. Barbara never forgot that silence. After the wedding, Barbara slowly disappeared from Christopher's life. Calls became short. Messages were ignored. Holidays became busy this year. When she visited, Karen always looked annoyed. "You should have called first," she would say at the door. Christopher stopped calling her mom and began saying Barbara in front of Karen's friends. Strange things also began happening. After meals at their house, Barbara felt dizzy and weak. Sometimes her hands shook. Sometimes she forgot simple words. Doctors said it was stress or age. Karen always had advice ready. "Drink this tea," she said. "Take these vitamins." One night Karen gave her warm cider. After 2 sips, Barbara felt lightheaded and sick. The next morning, she started a notebook. She wrote every meal, drink, and symptom carefully. Soon, a pattern appeared. Barbara studied the notebook every night. On days she ate at home, she felt normal. On days Karen served her food or drinks, the sickness returned. Headaches, shaking hands, memory fog, sudden sleepiness. It happened too often to be chance. Barbara said nothing. She smiled, thanked Karen, and watched carefully. One Sunday, Karen handed her iced tea after lunch. "Fresh lemon tea just for you," she said. Barbara took the glass, walked to the bathroom, and poured it into the sink. She returned with the empty glass. Karen smiled strangely. "Feeling better already?" she asked. Barbara's heart grew cold. She knew then the danger was real. Someone wanted her weak enough to doubt herself. From that day, Barbara began pretending to be confused while gathering proof in silence. Barbara started checking everything. She counted pills in her medicine bottle before each visit. She marked the labels with tiny pen dots. After one dinner, 2 pills were missing. She had not taken them. Another afternoon she opened her vitamin case and noticed a bitter smell. The tablets looked the same, but something was wrong. She placed them in a plastic bag and hid them at home. Then she bought a small camera and photographed drinks, bottles, and plates before touching them. Christopher noticed none of it. He was always busy or distracted. Ashley, however, watched Barbara with sharp eyes. "You look forgetful lately," Ashley said during brunch. Karen nodded sadly. "We worry about her." Barbara smiled gently. Inside, anger rose. They were building a story about her, and she finally understood it. Barbara called an old family friend named Mr. Lewis, a retired police chemist. She invited him for coffee at a quiet diner. "I need advice," she said softly. She showed him the notebook and the saved pills. He listened without laughing. "You did right by keeping records," he told her. "Do not accuse anyone yet. Keep collecting evidence." Barbara felt relief for the first time in months. Someone believed her. Mr. Lewis gave her clean envelopes and labels. "Store anything suspicious," he said. "Write dates on everything." Barbara followed every instruction. She saved leftover drinks, touched nothing without gloves, and wrote every detail down. She no longer felt helpless. She felt patient. If Karen and Ashley were planning something, Barbara would let them continue until they crossed a line too clear to deny. A text message arrived on Friday afternoon. "Family dinner Saturday. Can't wait to see you." It was from Karen. Barbara stared at the cheerful words for a long time. She knew these dinners were never about family. They were about control. She replied simply, "See you then." On Saturday evening she arrived carrying apple pie. Karen hated apple pie but pretended to love it. "Barbara, you shouldn't have," Karen said with a bright smile. The house looked perfect. Candles glowed. Country music played softly. Ashley was already seated at the kitchen island, sipping wine. Christopher greeted his mother with a quick side hug. "Glad you made it," he said, then returned to checking messages on his phone. Barbara looked around the room calmly. Tonight, she felt no fear. Only readiness. Dinner was simple American food: grilled steak, baked potatoes, green beans, and dinner rolls. Barbara served herself carefully and ate only what she trusted. Ashley talked about real estate prices. Karen laughed at everything she said. Christopher remained quiet. After the plates were cleared, Karen stood up. "I made cocktails for everyone," she announced. She moved gracefully at the bar cart, adding ice, fruit, and herbs. Then she carried one tall pink drink to Barbara. "This one is special," Karen said. "Only for you." Barbara looked into her eyes and smiled. "Thank you, dear." She set the glass down untouched. A few minutes later Ashley stood to answer a phone call. Karen turned toward the kitchen. In one smooth motion, Barbara switched the glasses again. Then she sat back down and began to wait. Barbara watched the clock without seeming to watch it. She asked Ashley about her new beach condo and complimented the curtains. Ashley proudly talked on and on. Karen kept glancing at Barbara's glass, expecting it to be empty. When she noticed the drink still looked full, confusion touched her face. "Not thirsty?" Karen asked lightly. "I'm taking my time," Barbara replied. Christopher laughed at something on his phone and missed the tension completely. 15 minutes passed. Ashley sipped again and wiped her lips. Barbara stayed calm, hands folded in her lap. She had learned patience through years of hardship. If she was wrong, nothing would happen. If she was right, truth would soon speak louder than anyone in the room. Karen smiled again, but it no longer looked natural. At 35 minutes, Ashley paused mid-sentence. She blinked several times and touched her throat. "This room feels hot," she muttered. Christopher looked up. "Want some water?" he asked. Ashley nodded, but when she reached for the glass, her fingers trembled. Karen stood so quickly her chair tipped backward. "Mom," she said sharply. Ashley tried to answer, but her words were thick and slow. She pushed herself up, stumbled, and fell back into the chair. Christopher rushed to her side. "Call 911, someone shouted. Karen grabbed her phone with shaking hands. Barbara remained seated. She lifted the untouched glass in front of her. "Interesting," she said quietly. Karen turned pale. Ashley looked across the table at Barbara with sudden fear, as if she finally understood what had happened. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They laid Ashley flat and asked quick questions. What did she eat? What did she drink? Any medications? Karen spoke too fast. Maybe low blood sugar. Maybe stress. She's been tired lately. Barbara stepped forward and held out the glass. "She drank what was prepared for me," she said calmly. One paramedic took the glass, smelled it, and sealed it in a bag. Karen's face tightened. Christopher stared at his wife, then at his mother. "What does that mean?" he asked weakly. Barbara met his eyes. "It means I did not drink it." The room went silent except for the medical equipment beeping softly. Ashley groaned as they carried her outside. Karen tried to follow, but a police officer entering the house stopped her first. "Ma'am, I need a statement." The officer was young but serious. He asked everyone to remain calm and stay inside. Barbara brought out her notebook from her purse. "You should read this," she said. Page after page listed dates, meals, drinks, pills, and symptoms. The officer flipped through it slowly. His expression changed. "How long have you suspected something?" he asked. "Long enough to stop trusting what I was given," Barbara answered. Karen burst out angrily. "This is insane." She switched the drinks. The officer looked up. "You're saying she tampered with your mother's glass?" Karen opened her mouth, then hesitated. Christopher stepped backward like the floor had moved under him. The officer asked for the medicine bottles, vitamins, and anything used to make the cocktails. Karen protested, but he collected them all. Barbara returned home after midnight, exhausted but clear-minded. She sat alone in her kitchen and stared at the quiet room. For the first time in years, she did not feel crazy. She felt certain. The next morning, Christopher came to her house unannounced. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "Mom, what is happening?" he asked. Barbara poured coffee and said nothing for a moment. Then she answered, "The truth." Christopher sat heavily at the table. "Karen says you planned this." Barbara slid the notebook toward him. "Read." He turned pages slowly. His face changed with each one. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. Barbara looked at him steadily. "Because you stopped listening a long time ago." Christopher lowered his head, unable to answer. 3 days later, Detective Harris called Barbara. "We need you downtown," he said. She arrived carrying the saved pills, labeled envelopes, and extra notes. In the interview room, he asked steady questions. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" Barbara answered plainly. "No one would have believed me." She explained the dizziness, the memory fog, the altered vitamins, and the drinks. Harris listened carefully and wrote everything down. Then he asked the hardest question. "Why switch the glasses?" Barbara met his eyes. "Because I needed proof. I had spent 2 years wondering if I was losing my mind." Harris nodded slowly. He took the evidence for testing. As Barbara left, he said, "Mrs. Turner, You were smart to keep records. It was the first time authority had spoken to her with respect. The lab results came back in less than a week. Detective Harris visited Barbara in person. The drink contained a sedative, he said. Strong enough to cause confusion, dizziness, memory issues, and worse when mixed with alcohol. Barbara sat still, gripping the edge of her chair. Harris continued. We also found traces of the same substance in the pills you saved. Barbara closed her eyes briefly. She had been right all along. Ashley is recovering, he added. But this case is serious now. Barbara thanked him quietly. After he left, she stood by the kitchen window for a long time. Outside, children rode bicycles down the street. Life moved normally while hers had nearly been stolen in secret. She did not cry. She simply breathed deeply, as if air itself felt different now. Karen was questioned the next day. She first denied everything. Then her story changed. She said she only wanted Barbara to rest more. She claimed Barbara had been anxious and difficult. But the evidence kept speaking louder than excuses. Phone messages between Karen and Ashley showed private discussions about Barbara's confusion. Notes had been kept about forgetful moments, repeated stories, and tired behavior. Many of them written on days Barbara had been drugged. Detectives uncovered meetings with a lawyer about guardianship. They planned to declare Barbara mentally unfit and take control of her money and property. When Detective Harris told Barbara, she felt ice in her chest. They had not wanted her dead. They wanted her erased, quietly and legally. Years of work and sacrifice had nearly been handed to people who smiled at her dinner table. Christopher came to Barbara's house that evening looking broken. He stood at the door like a lost child. I didn't know, he said before sitting down. Barbara remained standing. Didn't know what? She asked. Tears filled his eyes. About the lawyer. About the pills. About any of it. Barbara studied his face. He looked tired, older, ashamed. But you knew I was suffering, she said quietly. Christopher lowered his head. Karen said you were getting confused. Barbara's voice hardened. And you believed her. He had no answer. Silence filled the room. Finally he whispered, I'm sorry, Mom. Barbara looked at the man she had raised and saw both her son and a stranger. Sorry cannot return the years you gave away, she said. Christopher began to cry openly. That night Barbara made a decision. She called Arthur, the family lawyer who had known her and her late husband for decades. The next morning she sat across from him in his small office. I want to change everything, she said. Arthur listened as she explained the poisoning, the scheme, and Christopher's silence. He removed his glasses slowly. I'm sorry, Barbara. She nodded. Remove Karen completely. Remove Christopher too. Arthur asked no foolish questions. He simply opened a folder and began writing notes. Barbara also chose several charities her husband had loved, a veteran shelter, a trade scholarship, and a community food center. Let good people use what we built, she said. Arthur smiled sadly. That sounds like you. For the first time since the nightmare began, Barbara felt the future shifting back into her hands. Barbara had one person left to think about, her granddaughter, Emma. The child was only 6, bright-eyed and gentle. She loved drawing pictures for Barbara and once whispered, Grandma, your hugs fix sad feelings. Barbara never forgot those words. She told Arthur to create a trust for Emma. The money would be protected until Emma turned 25. Neither Karen nor Christopher would control a single dollar. Can that be done? Barbara asked. Arthur nodded. Yes, and it will be strong. Barbara smiled faintly. Good. I want the child safe from the mistakes of adults. She also added a private letter for Emma to read one day. In it, Barbara planned to explain everything with honesty, not bitterness. Some truths should wait until a heart is old enough to carry them. Barbara then wrote another letter, this one for Christopher. She wrote it by hand at her kitchen table. She described the drinks, the sickness, the fear, and the loneliness of not being believed. She did not insult him. She simply told the truth. "You were not the one who poisoned me," she wrote, "but you helped by looking away." She folded the letter and sealed it. Arthur would deliver it only after her passing. Barbara wanted no arguments, no tears at her doorstep, no desperate promises made too late. Some lessons must arrive when excuses can no longer interrupt them. When she finished writing, she felt lighter. Pain placed into clear words often loses some of its weight. She put down the pen and slept peacefully that night. Within a month, Barbara sold her house. She packed only what mattered: clothes, family photos, journals, and a necklace her husband had given her years ago. She left the heavy furniture and heavier memories behind. Without telling many people, she moved to a small coastal town in America where no one knew her story. She rented a white cottage with chipped paint and blue shutters. The sea could be heard from the porch at night. Neighbors waved kindly but did not pry. Barbara planted rosemary, basil, and tomatoes in the yard. She baked bread, walked the shoreline, and learned again how peaceful silence could feel. This was not the silence of swallowing pain. It was the silence of safety. Each morning she woke without fear of what someone might hand her to drink. Christopher texted often at first. "Hope you're okay. Can we talk? I miss you, Mom." Barbara read the messages but did not reply. Not out of cruelty, but because apologies without understanding are only noise. Months later he called from an unknown number. She answered by mistake. "Mom, please," he said immediately. "I left Karen." Barbara said nothing. He rushed on. Karen had emptied accounts, opened credit cards in his name, and vanished after charges were filed. Ashley refused to help and blamed everyone else. Christopher sounded shattered. Barbara listened quietly. When he finally stopped talking, she asked one question. "Do you believe me now?" There was a long pause. Then he whispered, "Yes." Barbara thanked him for the truth and ended the call. Years passed gently. Barbara began volunteering at a small community center near the harbor. She helped seniors fill out forms, read stories to children, and served soup on Thursdays. People there knew her simply as Barbara. They did not know about poisoned drinks, court papers, or betrayal. They only knew she was dependable and warm. One rainy afternoon Christopher appeared outside the center, older and thinner than before. He waited until she finished locking the door. "Can we sit?" he asked. They took a bench under the awning. Rain tapped the roof above them. "I'm ashamed," he said. "I chose comfort over truth." Barbara looked ahead at the wet street. "That is the first honest thing you've said in years," she replied. Christopher bowed his head, accepting the words without defense. Christopher spoke for a long time. He admitted how Karen slowly turned him against his own mother. She mocked Barbara, then called it jokes. She hid calls and messages, then said Barbara was being dramatic. When Barbara became ill, Karen claimed age was catching up with her. "I wanted peace," Christopher said. "So I believed the easier story." Barbara nodded slowly. "Peace built on lies never lasts," she replied. Rain continued falling around them. Christopher wiped his face with trembling hands. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. Barbara looked at him carefully. "Forgiveness is not the same as trust," she said. "One may come. The other may never return." Christopher accepted the answer. It was more mercy than he believed he deserved. Barbara invited Christopher to her cottage the following week. She served tomato soup, grilled cheese sandwiches, and warm apple pie. He looked around the small home in surprise. "You built all this alone?" he asked. Barbara smiled faintly. "I built my first life alone, too." After dinner, she showed him the garden and the sea beyond it. Christopher seemed humbled by the simplicity of her peace. "I thought success looked bigger than this," he admitted. Barbara touched a rosemary plant gently. "Many people do," she said. "That is why they lose what matters while chasing what shines." Christopher helped wash dishes before leaving. It was a small act, but it reminded Barbara of the kind boy he had once been. Court matters continued in the background. Karen accepted a plea deal to avoid a longer trial. She faced penalties, restitution orders, and restrictions that followed her for years. Ashley tried to deny everything, but the messages and plans tied her to the scheme. Her reputation collapsed among the very people whose approval she treasured. Barbara did not attend the hearings. She had no need to sit in another room while liars explained themselves. Detective Harris sent updates when necessary. "Justice moves slowly," he told her once. Barbara answered, "Slow is fine. Truth does not need to run." Then she returned to planting flowers. The law would do its work. She preferred doing hers, living well. Emma visited during summer break when she turned 10. Christopher brought her and stayed at a nearby motel. Barbara welcomed the child warmly. Emma ran through the garden laughing and asked endless questions about shells, birds, and baking bread. "Grandma, can I help?" she asked whenever Barbara started anything. Together they made pancakes, painted flower pots, and walked the beach collecting smooth stones. Barbara saw none of Karen's coldness in the girl. Only kindness and curiosity. One evening Emma hugged her tightly and said, "I wish I lived closer." Barbara kissed her forehead. "Distance cannot stop love," she replied. Christopher heard those words from the doorway and quietly wiped his eyes. After that visit, Barbara considered what healing should look like. It did not mean forgetting. It did not mean pretending nothing happened. It meant choosing what could still grow after the fire. She began speaking to Christopher more often, though carefully. Short calls became longer ones. He asked advice again. He listened this time. When he apologized, he no longer rushed past the damage. He named it plainly. Barbara respected that. One afternoon she handed Arthur a note. "If Christopher continues walking honestly," she said, "leave him my wedding watch. Nothing more." Arthur smiled. "A symbol, not a reward." Barbara nodded. "Exactly. Some relationships return as they were. Others return smaller, wiser, and more truthful. She could live with that." Autumn arrived with cool winds from the sea. Barbara spent mornings at the community center and afternoons in her garden. She taught children how to bake cornbread and helped older neighbors learn email. Her life had become steady and useful. One day a volunteer asked, "How do you stay so calm?" Barbara smiled. "I stopped trying to control other people," she said. "I only manage myself." The young woman laughed, thinking it was simple advice. But Barbara knew peace had cost her dearly. It had been bought with betrayal, loneliness, and hard choices. Even so, she would pay that price again to live free. Some lessons are expensive because they are worth keeping. Christopher continued visiting every few months. He no longer arrived asking for forgiveness. He came carrying groceries, fixing broken hinges, or helping with yard work. One Saturday he repaired the porch steps in silence. When he finished, Barbara handed him lemonade. "Thank you," she said. Christopher looked surprised. "For the steps?" he asked. "For showing up without needing applause," Barbara replied. He lowered his eyes. "I learned that too late." Barbara shook her head gently. "Late is better than never." They sat together watching gulls circle above the water. The silence between them no longer felt hostile. It felt careful, like two people rebuilding a bridge one board at a time. Emma grew older and brighter each year. She loved books, science kits, and asking difficult questions. During one visit she noticed the locked wooden box on Barbara's shelf. "What's inside?" she asked. Barbara smiled. "Letters for the future." Emma's eyes widened. "For me too." Barbara nodded. "Yes, but not yet." Emma accepted that answer and returned to her puzzle. Barbara admired the child's patience. Many adults lacked it. That night Barbara added one more page to Emma's letter. She wrote about courage, honesty, and how kindness must never be mistaken for weakness. She wanted the girl to inherit more than money. She wanted her to inherit wisdom earned through pain. News of Karen reached Barbara through town gossip and one short call from Christopher. Karen had moved twice, struggled with debt, and blamed everyone except herself. Ashley's health had declined, and she lived quietly now, far from the social circles she once chased. Barbara listened without pleasure. Misery in others did not heal old wounds. "Do you feel sorry for them?" Christopher asked. Barbara considered the question. "I feel finished with them," she answered. That was truer than anger and cleaner than revenge. Some people punish themselves by refusing to change. Barbara no longer needed anything from them, not apologies, not suffering, not explanations. Their chapter in her life had already closed. On her 70th birthday, the community center surprised Barbara with cake, flowers, and a handmade banner. Children hugged her legs while neighbors applauded. Christopher and Emma stood in the back, smiling. Barbara looked around the room and felt overwhelmed. Years earlier she had nearly lost herself at a polished dinner table. Now she stood among ordinary people who valued honesty more than image. When it was time to speak, she kept it short. "Thank you for giving me a place where truth matters," she said. Everyone cheered. Later, Christopher handed her a small wrapped gift. Inside was a fresh notebook. "For new memories," he said softly. Barbara held it close and smiled. That evening, after the party ended, Barbara sat alone on her porch with the new notebook in her lap. The sea moved gently in the dark, steady and faithful. She opened the first page and wrote one sentence: "I was not destroyed." Then she smiled and continued writing about gardens, children's laughter, warm bread, and second chances. She noticed something important. The painful years now took up only a few pages, while the peaceful years kept growing longer. That was how healing worked. Hurt could be loud, but joy lasted longer when cared for. Barbara closed the notebook and looked at the stars. The life they tried to shrink had become wider than ever. Months later, Barbara asked Christopher to walk with her along the beach. The wind was cool, and Emma ran ahead collecting shells. Barbara stopped and handed Christopher the old wedding watch she had once promised through Arthur. "You earned this by becoming honest," she said. Christopher's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve it," he replied. Barbara nodded. "Maybe not. But you can honor it." He fastened the watch carefully to his wrist as if it were made of glass. Then he hugged his mother, not as a guilty man begging for mercy, but as a son finally grateful for truth. Barbara returned the embrace without fear. Years before, Barbara had almost been erased by lies served in a pretty glass. But lies are weak things. They need silence, fear, and obedience to survive. Barbara gave them none in the end. She answered cruelty with patience, deception with proof, and loss with a new life built by her own hands. She never needed revenge to win. She needed clarity, courage, and time. In the small American town by the sea, people simply knew her as Barbara, the woman who helped strangers, baked the best pies, and listened without judging. That was enough. She had lost money, family peace, and years of trust. Yet she gained herself back. And in the end, that was the greatest inheritance of all. If this ending gave you chills or left you speechless, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell because my next story might just be even wilder. And please drop a comment below. I read every single one.